most it was just once a week. All countries, with the exception of Belgium, took some sort of action after reading a blog. And this is a difficult thing to tease out. And the question we asked, we gave people a list of activities. So after reading a blog, are you more likely to do the following? You know, write to an MP, ring the media, sign a petition, get involved in direct action. And again, you're going to have to make your own interpretation, lies, damn lies and statistics, how much of that is relevant. It's a difficult thing to get out. But it did seem to imply that people were more likely to take action after having read a blog. US respondents much more likely to have written or called a politician, and they tend to be much more active in the US generally. And people in France, USA and Belgium were significantly more likely to have attended a political rally speech. So I think what that was beginning to show was that blogging, I think we all accept, is having a significant impact on mainstream media, point one. And point two, people who read blogs and write blogs tend to be much more politically active, not just in party politics, but in issues and in, you know, the sorts of corporate issues that affect, you know, a lot of our organisations. So it is spreading over into the mainstream.
Thank you. We've had a few questions and answers already, but I was going to turn it over to our panellists to say a few words. And Iain, since we've just finished with a political point and some consumer research, perhaps you could give us a couple of minutes on your perspectives.
Yeah, first of all, I'm going to disagree with virtually every word that you said, because I think what you failed to realise is that British blogging is 3 or 4 years behind US blogging. Britain is also a much smaller country, and therefore I think there is the same sense of community among different types of bloggers, but we're just sort of slightly sort of behind the, well, in fact 3 or 4 years behind the US. I mean, I was slightly surprised by this list because I've only heard of 2 other blogs apart from my own on it, mainly because I suppose maybe I just look at political blogs rather than others. And I would also question whether just the number of inbound links to a blog is really the best way of testing its influence. In that, I mean, while I'm delighted to be in the top 10, and I hope I would be in any top 10, however you measured it, there are several blogs which I would say were far more influential than 1 or 2 on that list. Guido Fawkes, for example, who you saw on one of the slides there. I mean, he has broken major stories ahead of the mainstream media, and yet doesn't feature on that list. So I think there's all sorts of ways you can do it, whether you do it by page downloads, unique visitors, however, you're always going to get a different top 10 list. I think it's very interesting that this event is taking place, because obviously Edelman see an opportunity here for their business. And there's no doubt that if I write about a multinational company on my blog, it does have an effect. I saw on the list there are some people from Orange here who will have been scarred by their recent experience. Who are they? They will have been scarred by their recent experience of one of their employees writing an article on Conservative Home, which was then picked up by the Muslim Public Affairs Committee. Now, I understand that they suspended this guy for writing the article, and it caused an absolute outrage on the right-wing blogs, and they were bombarded with messages encouraged by people like me to say, look, you've got to defend this guy. This is a free speech issue. And I understand he's now been reinstated, and I suspect that it was partly because they had a lot more messages from people from our blogs than they did from the Muslim Public Affairs Committee. Now, I don't just write about politics, I write about anything that happens to me in my life. I had a very bad experience with Vodafone recently, so I thought I would share that with the world. Vodafone then repaired the damage, not because they didn't get in contact with me, but I then had a good experience with them 2 days later, so I readdressed the balance. But I think there is going to come a time when people in this room are going to launch concerted campaigns to protect their reputations through the blogs, and I suspect a lot of it will be done anonymously. Politicians are already doing it. I know of one member of the Conservative shadow cabinet that has someone trawl all of the blogs, all the main political blogs, first thing in the morning, and if this particular person is criticised in any way, somebody will post on putting the other side of the story. Now, in a sense, it's an obvious thing to do, but people are only just catching on to this, that your reputation can easily be trashed, and you've got to protect it.
Nick, you've been helping the BBC generate its own sort of approach to blogging in various ways. Your perspective, I mean, the BBC does also have a lot of foreign language blogs, but your perspectives on today would be gratefully received.
Well, I mean, I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that Iain has said. First of all, I think the political culture in this country is very different from the political culture in the United States, and we touched on that in some of the presentation. I think that it's clear that political blogging has had some impact, but it's mainly had that impact with opinion formers. And I'll tell you a story, which is it's a Conservative Party conference last week. My boss is controller of editorial policy. He came back from the Tory Party conference and said, "I met Guido Fawkes," and I shook him by the hand. And I thought to myself, well, what does that show you? He also met Iain, of course, but then he knows you already. I mean, he'd met you before, but he'd never met Guido before. Okay, now what does that tell you? What that tells you is that Guido is now in the club. And the club is, what do we want to call them? Opinion formers, influencers. They used to call it the establishment. Guido has been very clever. He's used blogging to develop a presence for himself, and he's now been allowed in the club. Okay? But that does not mean that political blogging has had a great deal of impact outside the club, outside the class of journalists, politicians, opinion formers. And I was very interested in one statistic there which showed the amount of, I think, political blogging in the UK, or political activity in the UK, was very low compared to the other activities. So we shouldn't overestimate the impact of political blogging in the UK outside that particular group of people. I'd like to pick up on something else that Iain says, which I think is absolutely right, which is reputation management, customer care, whatever you want to call it, HR, whatever, PR. This is a really important way of relating to and talking to the people who are interested in your organisation and your products and services. And you've got to get it right. I've said several times in the course of the work that I've been doing to the people in the BBC press office and at the corporate centre, very clearly, this is not like dealing with the press. This is not like some kind of corporate initiative where you send an email to 5,000 employees. It's a personal medium, I think. It's about people and individuals, and they expect a personal, individual touch. And that is quite difficult for, obviously lots of people in the room are far ahead than me, but I still think it's quite difficult for big organisations to get to grips with that, because these are people's personal spaces. They do not want an email which tells you what the line is today. They don't want that. They want somebody important to come and talk to them. And that is a real challenge, I think, for the BBC and generally for people. You have to be quite shrewd in the way that you manage that, because if you get it wrong, it's not just that your reputation will be damaged as well. Because if you send them a standard email, they'll go, "Look at this terrible standard email that I got. Isn't it a load of rubbish? It doesn't answer my queries at all." People have done that on blogs. So I suppose, without rambling on, that's a couple of points I'd like to make.
Kevin, over to you.
And just to build on what Nick is saying too, I think blog shouldn't be seen just as another way to get your message out to people. This is a way to respond to your customers' needs. I'll give you an example. A week or two ago at The Guardian, we did our weekly media podcast, and someone quite helpfully slagged it off. But it was a very useful slagging off, and they said in the comments it was actually a producer's post-mortem. What we would do at the BBC if a program had gone horribly wrong. Not that it ever does. Everything at the BBC is a triumph, Nick. We know that. And I say that as a former BBC employee.
I know how true that is.
Yes. And the thing was, we took a look at that very helpful comment, and the next week we made changes to the media podcast. We had 80 comments thanking us for taking on board the criticism from the week before, and it was a better podcast. So it is not just something to put your message out there, it's actually a way to make your product better. I think going back to the political trends, and I won't bang on this too much because it's been covered by Iain and Nick pretty well, but I had a call from a former colleague at the BBC about politics and blogging, and she said, well, what about international trends? I said, there are no international trends in political blogging, they're all national. I would say Iran is probably the most politically active blogging country in the world. I mean, the president has a blog of sorts. And she said, well, Ahmadinejad has a blog. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, almost every major politician has to have a blog in Iran to be